So this is Stefanie Meyer, this is Edma Ajanovic, and me, I'm Birgit Sauer, and we're talking about gender as symbolic glue for right-wing actors. In Europe, our presentation will focus on the case of Austria, and we borrowed this title, Gender as Symbolic Glue, for our presentation from Esther Kovacs and Mari Poem. They put together a volume on anti-gender discourse, anti-genderism across Europe. And so we borrowed because we find this an extremely nice metaphor to show what is going on in this anti-gender mobilization. And we find these anti-gender mobilization across Europe. We find it in Russia, we find it in the US. And just to give you some examples for those who are not that familiar with the European context, we have in France the Manif pour tous, which is a mobilization against same-sex marriage, for instance. We have in Germany mobilization against sexual education at schools. In Bavaria, in Baden-Württemberg, in Slovenia, we had a referendum against same-sex marriage, so you could see, and this is all combined with a sort of anti-gender discourse. Even on the EU level, we have a mobilization on different reports on the EU level. For instance, the report of the Austrian Member of Parliament, Ulrike Lunacek, the so-called Lunacek report, also on homosexuality. So we have a lot of mobilization against this gender. So we try to explain, and these actors, they talk either about gender theory, they talk about genderism, or they talk about gender ideology. And of course, this is kept rather vague when they refer to this notion of gender ideology or gender theory. Interestingly, in all countries, the English term gender is used, as well as in the German language. They don't talk about Geschlecht, which would be the German word, but they talk about gender, and they say, well, you could see there isn't even a German word, so it's worse and worse in the mobilization. So using this English term is already meaningful. And the other feature with it, which is important in these debates, is a strategical misreading of deconstructivist feminist theory and queer theory. So gender is then presented as dissolving men and women's body, for instance, deconstructing gender at all, of course, abolishing all sexual differences. And especially in Austria, we have a discourse in the right that the aim would be the creation of a genderless human being, or of making little boys into little girls and things. So it's really a horrifying scenario, this misrepresentation of gender theory. Also, the notion of ideology, when they talk about gender ideology, ring the bell for sort of false consciousness. It's bad, it's not clear, and so on. That's why they talk about ideology and not about theory, for instance. And again, they draw this notion when they talk about gender ideology. Explicitly, it's ideology. It's like communism. It's like socialism. And is that bad? Gender is as bad as socialism, for instance. So you find this in the debate. Yeah, and you can also see that this is a sort of theory. When they talk about theory, they say it's against all practical evidence. It's only theory by some of these elitist feminists or elitist politicians who want to push forward their theory or their ideology. So, and because the concept is so vague, we want to grasp this concept, and here referring to Laclau and Mouffe as an empty signifier, and I don't want to go into this concept of empty signifier, but gender is used that you have a lot of so-called chains of equivalence, which then say when you talk about gender, you talk about LGBT people, you talk about equality and inequality. So you have a whole, just point to a whole program when you use this or when they use this anti-gender discourse, and so gender serves as a signifier, of course, against equality, against emancipation, and of course as a signifier which disarticulates class. And I pass to Edma.
All right. First off, a little bit about, do you hear me like that, or is it, no? Is it better? Yes. Okay.
Skip this one. Skip this.
So we will continue with the Austrian, to focus on Austria. So focusing on Austria, we want to show that the anti-gender discourse forms a central part of the right-wing mobilizations. It should not be dismissed as a special interest. The second thing we want to show with our presentation is that this discourse facilitates the creation of new alliances among former competitors or even political enemies within the Austrian right. And the third thing we want to show is that the anti-gender discourse is instrumental in attempts to construct a right-wing hegemony, because it does not only relate to gender and sexuality, but also to the naturalization of all kinds of differences and thereby legitimizing inequality. So in order to show this, we would like to present some empirical findings, or Stefanie will present these. And in the next slide, I would like to focus on of some points of the Austrian context, and especially the political context of the gender ideology discourse in Austria. So historically, or the first point is that historically Austria had two competing variants of far-right politics. They can be traced back to the so-called Catholic Austrofascism and the more secular German National Socialism of the 1930s. So as we will see, gender ideology is one of the fields where the former antagonism between those two camps is actually making a way for new alliances between them. Among right-wing actors in Austria, of course, the Freedom Party is the most important today. For our topic, especially its turn in the early 1990s is very important, because the party at that time changed its representation from a traditional German nationalist right-wing extremist group to a more Austrian nationalist right-wing populist party or movement. The third point, which is also particularly interesting in Austria, is that the liberalization of gender regimes and sexual politics started in Austria in the 1970s, and it is still ongoing, of course, but this liberalization always engaged also conservative counter-movements as well. So, on the other hand, Austria still features a conservative welfare state building on conservative family ideals, with a male breadwinner and a female part-time working housekeeper who is also responsible for the education and upbringing of the children. So in sum, the situation is quite ambivalent, with this huge differences between cities and the rural areas. So I would like to start with a short introduction into our empirical study. It's about the actors on the anti-gender discourse in Austria we looked into. So, and Stefanie will go on with the empirical findings. So in Austria, the discourse on gender ideology, which actually the Vatican has already been establishing since the mid-1990s, became publicly known in 2008, sorry. This is when the Freedom Party representative Barbara Rosenkrantz published a book on gender mainstreaming. Since then, the topic has been growing and new topics and new actors entered the scene. For our analysis, we identified 5 broad clusters of actors that are most active on gender ideology in Austria. Although they have some distinctions and sometimes these are very blurred and the networks span different clusters, actors can be grouped according to their ideological or normative background. The first cluster would be includes groups with a background in this right-wing extremism and right-wing populism. This cluster includes a range of different political parties. The most important is, as I said, the Freedom Party Austria, with its associated organizations and media. This cluster also includes some small independent groups or activists, which are, for instance, the Identitarian Movement Austria. The second cluster we identify is the cluster of right-wing Catholic conservatism. Although many of the political demands which they voice are similar to those of the first group, they are historically developed in a different ideological background. As I argued before, there is this big the antagonism between the Catholic and the German nationalist conservatives in Austria. So groups within this cluster range from the right wing of the Christian Conservative People's Party to smaller conservative groups, which are often strongly backed by former nobility. So groups in this cluster share a Catholic background but are working in the political field. The third cluster is formed by Catholic and Christian conservative organizations. These are mainly, they see religion itself and the spreading of Christian values as their main goals. So this cluster includes a number of very small Christian parties, independent Christian associations as the Human Life International or Youth for Life, and actors directly affiliated with the Catholic Church, which also includes some bishops, for instance. So also independent Catholic online media are very outspoken on issues on gender ideology. It is also important to point out the differences within the Catholic Church in this regard, which is, for instance, where you have, for instance, conservative Catholic media attacking the Catholic women's movement for being part of the gender and abortion mafia, as they call it. I would speed up a little bit and just name the fourth cluster, which is mainly encompasses groups who mobilize for men's and fathers' rights. They fight, for instance, for real or also alleged discrimination of men, especially in family legislation. And the fifth cluster we identify is the group of so-called concerned parents, which lobby against sexual education or the use of gender-sensitive language in schools. So as this overview shows, issues surrounding gender ideology serve as a point of convergence between actors who actually embody traditional antagonistic right-wing orientations. These alliances, which we talk about, for instance, became tangible in the so-called marches for the family, which have been held against the Vienna Pride since 2012. They are mainly organized by Catholic associations and also draw support from some right-wing extremists, including open neo-Nazis. This was the case in 2014. I will stop here and ask you to continue. Should we change?
There are nearly 0 minutes left.
Oh, okay. So I'll try to be extremely brief now. Well, this would be on the method. We worked with critical frame analysis. The important point here is that we focused on the analysis of how problems and implied solutions were constructed in a number of texts we selected from the actors that Edma just presented. And we were able to identify some overarching frames that reappeared in the material again and again, and that were used by all the different actors from different groups. And maybe the most important one is what we call gender is, sex is nature. It's this idea that gender ideology negates nature, negates the natural and therefore valuable gender order, as Birgit has already pointed out in the beginning, and this is the baseline of nearly all the arguments we analyzed. And of course, this discourse then feeds into a number of threats, like the threat to the biological reproduction of the autochthonous population, which the right-wing extremists, for example, then use again to link it to racist concerns about biopolitics. The second one, science trumps ideology, is closely linked to this. It's the idea that gender ideology, or most importantly gender studies, contradict natural sciences or ignore them, ignore especially the findings of biology, which have little to do with what biology actually is talking about, but with an idea of science, of a common sense idea of science, that science stands for the unbiased application of logic and reason to a given phenomena, so deeply against constructivism and against the idea that science itself is a social enterprise. And this, then the argument runs that gender studies would only claim science to be a social enterprise in order to legitimate themselves and to hide their completely unscientific nature. And the argument then goes on to say that while gender studies are completely worthless in terms of scientific and academic regards, they have become extremely powerful at universities and they gag their critics, so to speak, which leads directly to the next frame, which is the most common one, the one we found most often, which is about the alleged authoritarianism or totalitarianism of gender ideology and gender studies. Gender ideology is therefore pictured as today's socialism, communism, or Marxism. All these terms are used interchangeably after their defeat in 1989. And it's about the notion of equality, which is used to bridge the idea of a classless and the genderless society. So this is how this linking works. And of course, again, it works more easily in German, where equality, if you translate it with Gleichheit, is indistinguishable from sameness. So they use this slippery term in order to legitimize this discourse. Gender-sensitive language is especially taken as an example for the authoritarian character of gender ideology. It's deemed a dictate, a politically correct codex, enforced by language police and thought control and so on. And sometimes this argument is even taken further and then includes any anti-discrimination legislation at all, because they turn it around and say anti-discrimination legislation discriminates the normal people because they are not allowed to discriminate anymore. So that's how the argument works. Yeah, another very important point for them is that they claim that gender ideology follows a hidden agenda. For example, they say, well, gender mainstreaming might claim to be about gender equality and equal chances for women and men, but in reality, it is about the denaturalization, destruction of sexual difference, of heterosexuality, and of the family. And this hidden agenda argument is important for them because first it underlines this anti-democratic character of gender knowledge. It plays into the narrative that there are elites working against their people. It allows actors to say, well, we are totally for equality, we are only against this gender ideology, which is about something else. And third, and maybe most importantly, it allows to render gender ideology as a threat in nearly all regards. It is by definition an obscure concept, and if it is obscure, you can put anything on it. So you can always open up the discourse for new topics, new threats, new phenomena that allegedly are brought about by gender ideology. The victims of gender ideology, I can be brief here. It's obviously men and boys that are most threatened by gender ideology, but it's also women because they are driven away from their natural longing for motherhood and care work. So that's another important line of work, which also kind of tries to incorporate women into this discourse. And it's also, the argument is then broadened to say, well, it's not only individuals, it's cultures, it's societies, it's Europe per se that's under threat, because gender ideology leads to a decline of male values and makes it impossible for our culture to defend itself against what they then call pre-modern cultures, meaning, of course, Islam, which leads directly to the last frame that we detected. Islam is not something that all actors talk about, but we found it repeatedly, and we think it's interesting because with this intersection of two discourses, right-wing actors define the long-term winner of this gender ideology destruction, and they link two of their most important discourses here. How exactly they tie Islam into the gender ideology narrative varies a bit, but it rests on a few common assumptions. One of them is that Islam is intrinsically sexist and homophobic. It's intolerant towards different, and it's striving for power in Europe. So that's the baseline of the argument about Islam. It's pictured then as necessarily adversarial to gender ideology, yet still ready to join forces against Christian Europe, against the Christian culture of Europe. So and this frame, we think, works to integrate this gender ideology discourse into a great narrative of inner decay and outer threat that unites these different right-wing actors that Edma talked about.
Mm-hmm. And very briefly, only one sentence. I don't want to go into our conclusions. I think, as you might see, there are new alliances. Gender creates new alliances between different actors, and I don't know if you came across the words of Pope Franciscus of this week, who is seen as a little bit a socialist hero in some circles, but he, again in an interview, said, well, this gender ideology is of evil. But I would say there are actors who are not explicitly right-wing, but the anti-gender discourse feeds into a right-wing populist discourse, and this discourse is, of course, a discourse against equality, against gender equality, against class equality, and it's against democracy, because in this antagonist setting, which is proposed in the anti-gender discourse, there's always the people emerging, and these people need some leadership, and that's why these right-wingers then conclude that there is a need for a more authoritarian vision of society. Thanks.
Thank you.